Hello and thanks for watching this. My name is Johannes Ulrich, and this recording here actually originated from a Tech Tuesday talk that I did a couple months ago. The talk had three parts, and I originally recorded the first part, then we never got around really to record the rest. And so this is really sort of catching up on these recording. The first thing I actually recorded was, well, here, the second part of the Tech Tuesday. That's the how to contribute part. What I want to do now here is go over the first part of this Tech Tuesday, and that's a little bit background of the Internet Storm Center. So, well, what is it all about and where did it start? There are actually a couple efforts that sort of led to the Internet Storm Center, one of which was incidents.org. Incidents.org is something that SANS started, well, at the end of 1999. Remember, people back then were concerned about Y2K and that attackers could possibly take advantage of Y2K bugs and launch attacks. SANS wanted to help people share information about Y2K. So SANS set up incidents.org, and people sent in emails with various vulnerabilities they sort of ran into. And there were a couple people around incidents.org, like Matt Fearnow, Stutzman, he had a Stutz report, and John Green were some of the principals there, Stephen Northcutt, and the site was really popular. People liked it, but then of course, people prepared well for Y2K. There was no big issue. So after Y2K, SANS took the site down. And well, that's when more emails came in and even phone calls asking, hey, that was actually a useful thing. So SANS continued the site, brought it back up. And what it was is, well, that's sort of where the word diary came from. You may still see our post being referred to as a diary because the people in charge that I just mentioned of incidents.org, they summarized sort of some of the email that came in a diary that they published each day. Now, a little bit later, I officially made it live. Was Thanksgiving break of 2000. I made live DShield.org. So DShield.org took a little bit of a different approach to information sharing, a more automated approach. Back then, I kept looking sort of at some of the firewall logs that I collected, friends collected, and what I sort of found is that a lot of people basically see the same attacks. And my training is in physics, so that's how I grew up basically, and I wanted to collect data. So I've taken that data approach to information security, and collecting these firewall logs allowed me to get a real nice sort of view of what was happening. And it actually couldn't have come at a better time, because what I saw was sort of some of the very early worms, like, Leaves and the later Code Red and Nimda were sort of some of the notable worms back then. And by being able to collect firewall logs from people that basically just donated them, that sort of helped me then really sort of draw an accurate picture of how these worms spread. And very exciting back then, of course. Well, SANS became aware of DShield.org and figured, hey, DShield.org and incidents.org really fit well together. With incidents.org, we sort of have the human part where people basically send in email, and with DShield.org, we sort of have the automated part to really sort of back up what's happening. And that then really became the Internet Storm Center. So the Internet Storm Center as it exists today is really sort of the merger of these two parts. We still refer to our posts as diaries because, well, back when it all started, the term blog actually didn't even exist yet. And I describe it also as this global network, a secure information sharing community. We try to be global. We try to really share information quickly. It's not like a CERT or something like this, like we don't have any hidden data or data that only a small group necessarily has access to. The data we collect is being made public pretty much instantaneously. So Yeah, participants really from all over the world. That's sort of where we get our data from people like you. And that's why I first recorded the participation slide, because that's really what the Internet Storm Center is all about. Is about people participating. And as it says here, there's still a real good sort of hobbyist base. It's not just meant for large corporation enterprises. It's really meant also for home users a little bit. And there's definitely sort of an education component here too, to teach people a little bit about security. And of course, there's SANS and a big professional training behind it. But everything that Storm Center does and all the data we collect is being turned around quickly and for free. Now, I mentioned some of the people that sort of started out in Incident.org. It was a small handful of people. Vicky Irvin, I should mention her. She was also in the early days there when I joined SANS. Well, since then, we have sort of grown that group that helps us really analyze it. And it's volunteers now. So we do have volunteer handlers, as we call them. And each day, one of these handlers is in charge, and you may see the name on the website. They will summarize what they saw, what they saw in their job, and what they saw from people submitting to us or in our data. And here, just a quick snapshot of some of the data. You may recognize now Renato. He's in Brazil. He wrote quite a few diaries. Russ, he's writing a lot about like tools and such that he's using. Xavier, also lots about malware analysis from him. So a bunch of these handlers, as we call them, you'll see them on the site and writing these posts like this. So really today, we have these two parts. We have the email being submitted by our readers. We have the data coming in from DShield. And all of this then contributes to the Internet Storm Center. The output, of course, is in part our diaries, but then also the data. So the data is being turned around pretty quickly. And I'll talk a little bit about how this works. We also added about 10 years ago, in 2010-ish, the Stormcast, so a daily podcast, just 5 minutes on your way to work in the morning. That's sort of how it's designed, sort of to make you sound smarter when you show up at work. That's always how I sort of describe the purpose of this podcast. So when I first started DShield, it was a pretty simple system. Actually, it was just a little bash script that grabbed the IP chains back then. It was pre-IP tables, firewall logs, and piped them to send mail and emailed them in. That script actually still works if you're still running it today. So we're collecting firewall logs. Now, Linux was sort of the original, easy one. And then we added a bunch of other logs later. The window size, we supported that with a little client that you could install. And this was really more useful back in the day when you had things like SolarAlarm and such, and where you had your system connected directly to the internet, which of course these days you don't necessarily do. You have more little routers and such. We do support some of these routers as well, but what we found over the years is it has become really difficult to support all these different routers and firewall software such as out there. On our website, you'll still find sort of support for about 30 or so different vendors. Now, of course, with newer version of firmware and such that may no longer work, was really difficult to maintain this. So in the last years, we really pushed a little Raspberry Pi honeypot that we ask our submitters to deploy, and that's what that second part that I mentioned earlier that I already had recorded is all about. And what this allows us is not just that it makes it easier for us to tell you how to deploy a sensor, because now it's really all about that Raspberry Pi, but it also allows us to get more diverse logs, the better logs. In the old ways, we only got firewall logs, and IP tables is pretty nice when it comes to firewall logs. But for example, some of these routers and such that people are using are not necessarily IP tables based, or even if they are Linux based, they don't give you full access to the logs, so you may not get sort of the full fidelity of the logs. Like some of them, for example, yes, they tell you what port was blocked, but not necessarily what protocol and such. So with the Raspberry Pi platform, we not only get everything we can get out of IP tables logs, but we can now also deploy like Cowrie. So now we get SSH and Telnet logs. So we see when someone is actually trying to log in. We have a little web server that allows us to create HTTP logs. And that's sort of where a lot of the attacks that we're interested in are really hitting is Telnet, SSH, and web server. In a web server, we can listen on different ports for HTTP requests. And that has really helped us in some of these past incidents, like some of these attacks against WebLogic, for example, or some of these security gateways and such that got attacked, the VPN endpoints that got attacked, Citrix. We can now see these attacks and see them way better than just knowing, hey, there was a packet blocked. So they actually see what attack was launched. The other thing this allows us to do now is also push out configuration. Now, this scheme here is really still under development, where we sort of go both ways here. And the idea here is, let's say, there is a new vulnerability for Citrix or WebLogic or whatever. So now we can turn all of these honeypots to emulate this particular software. So we can turn them all into Citrix servers, or let's say there is a new attack against toasters. We turn them all into toasters. And now we can tune sort of this telescope to really look into a specific direction, kind of like when you zoom in with an astronomy telescope into a particular part of the sky. We can now tune these honeypots to really just look at the very specific part of the attacks. Now, how does the system work in the backend? Well, so traditionally, the logs came in via SMTP, via email. These days, we have an HTTP API to do this. So the attacks come in, they're being queued. Our system actually is basically loads of resources, and we have learned over the years, sometimes painfully, how to make things fairly efficient. So when a log comes in, it's just being written as a flat text file into a directory, and that sort of helps against everybody submitting at the top of the hour and certain patterns if you try to discourage, but well, that just happened. And then we have a parser that will go through this directory, read these files, and well, parse them and make sure they have the correct format. Because when we accept them, we just accept them right into disk. And there's really no validation, not much really done there. So this parser takes care of this now. And it will, as output, create a standard formatted file that then every 30 minutes we take that file and pull it into our database. So what this means is the data that you see on the website is updated every 30 minutes. And by doing it every 30 minutes instead of sort of real time, we really get the performance much better. We avoid a lot of locking issues and things like that. So that's basically sort of how the back end works. And then of course you end up with all of these maps and the other output that we are creating with our website to be rather responsive and reasonable good based on sort of the back end hardware we have. So we don't have to throw like dozens of servers or so at this, and we can still deal with 10 plus terabytes sort of data here on the back end. But really, at this point, as far as our sensors are concerned, the core or the heart of all of it has become this Raspberry Pi. So if you would like to participate and submit your data, take a look at the second video that I recorded first, and it'll talk about how to actually set up this a Raspberry Pi turned into a honeypot. And this is something we are continuously developing and improving. And hopefully in 2021, we will have some substantial updates to how this works and the insight that also you can gain from into attacks that hit your network by deploying this honeypot. So what kind of resources do we offer? Well, there's a bunch of data, of course. We have these firewall logs that go back to November 2000 in some parts. I don't have them all online at this point, but working on finally sort of getting some back from backups and such. We went through multiple machines and such, of course, over the years. So have to make sure everything is in the right spot there. As far as web application logs go, that again comes from the honeypot, so they don't go back that far, and that's still very much in development. But we also have a couple other things where we sort of go out and collect data that we find useful. For example, headers from websites. It's a little project that Jason Lamb and myself created, and what we're looking for here is for our defending web application class. We wanted to know some of these defensive headers, like the strict transport security policy and things like this. How many people are actually using them? And that's sort of what this is about. Certificate revocation lists. We saw there in the past a couple times sort of big incidents, in particular with certificate authorities, reflected themselves in the size of certificate revocation lists. So that's something we have been collecting. Not sure if we'll continue that with Let's Encrypt and we move to OCSP and such instead of CRLs. This has become less valuable, but we'll see. And then, of course, and again from our honeypot, all of these SH and Telnet brute force logging attempts. So usernames and passwords being used there. Where do they come from? IP addresses that originate them and such. So all of this you can find in our data and on our website. Now, how to use the data? I would say use it to add color to your logs. It provides great context. If you have an IP address attacking you and you find this IP address on our website launching the same attack against thousands of others, then you probably know that this is not a targeted attack that you really should worry about. We highly recommend against using our list as a block list. And the reason being that on particular firewall logs, there are false positives, spoofed hits. We had that a couple times happens and such. Sometimes firewall logs will just block responses from websites that are too slow or DNS servers and such. Yes, there are false positives in the data, so please don't use it sort of blindly as a block list, but it certainly can help you to better understand your own logs and what you are seeing in your environment. Now, if you want to consume our data in bulk, we do have once a day, we create a digest essentially of our data, all the source IP addresses that we saw hitting our sensors, all the target ports they hit, when it start, when it end. So in particular, if you want to import the data into your SIEM and our API is too slow for you, or you're hitting some rate limits there, just download the data once a day, and then you have basically all the data from the prior day. And of course, you can keep the data around and collect it for a couple of weeks or whatever you find useful there. Now, for researchers, we also have sort of a raw access to the data. We're pretty open about this. There's not a big qualification that's how you have to go through, but you basically have a research project where the results will be published openly. We sort of give you access to that. And the reason we don't sort of provide sort of totally open access is that this research fee takes a little bit of work to actually offer that, and we can't really have too many people pull that feed from our side. Now, you probably have noticed I really like people to participate and send us their data. There's sort of a couple reasons why people sometimes don't send their data, and just to dispel some of these common myths here. So first always people say, hey, my data is not really all that important. Well, perfectly true, as long as you just look at your data. But what's different about submitting data to us is that it will be aggregated with all the other people's data. And now we get rid of a lot of the noise, and we're able to draw conclusions about attacks that hit multiple targets. So your data becomes a lot more valuable by actually contributing to our data. Now, what about your employer? Should you deploy a honeypot in your corporate network? Well, sure, if you can, great if you can do that, but not really necessary. Home networks are very useful as well. It doesn't really help us to have, let's say a /24 or such. That's just 256 times the same data. Instead, one IP address is perfectly fine. Your home network, perfectly fine. We get great data from home users, because what we are looking for is these attackers that just scan everybody indiscriminatorily. So that's really what we're going after. We're not really looking at targeted attacks. That's something that our sensors are not really built to detect. We are looking at attacks that hit the internet at large. And that's also why it's so useful then for us to notify people about this, because this is then an attack that affects everybody. So that's really what we're after. And then, well, is it difficult to submit data? Not really, I think. It's setting up that honeypot. Probably the most difficult part where people always have issues with is actually exposing that honeypot to inbound traffic, because often you have additional firewalls in your DSL or cable modem or in your router. So you have to figure out how to get the data into the honeypot. And gladly will help you with that. And that's sort of part also of the documentation that we are actively improving. Now, anyway, so what are some of the questions that you could answer with our data? One here is, now, how do others see me? You can look up your IP addresses in our data and see what you can find. Like I said, it's not always that you're an attacker. It may just be that your website is reporting too slowly, or it could be that you do have a bot in your network that's scanning the internet. So you definitely want to know, and that's we have an API here. That's the last URL that I have here. IP info and IP details. These are simple web pages. Don't scrape the HTML on the web pages. Now use the API, and that's a lot more efficient on our side. So that'll perform a lot better for you. So here is IP info as an example. So here you have an IP that actually we specifically labeled as whitelisted. And so an IP address that you should probably not block. Now, I'll totally leave it up to you if you block or not. But then often there is like a little comment or something like this about an IP address like this, why you may want to consider not blocking it. Now, here this one is a little bit ambivalent, I would say. So in this case here, it says that this is actually used by this census research project. Well, you may not want to get listed by census, and we actually have an API feed with research IP addresses like this to then that you could block, so you don't show up in sites like Shodan and Census and such. But again, that's up to you how you use the data. But of the plain data itself, you probably don't want to use that without some additional investigation. So additional threat data. So here we have also some external feeds that we pull in. And which one is this here? Yeah, this is actually a feed that we create. That this is Census. This is a part of that research group where this IP address. But you may find other items listed here from similar projects to ours, where we sort of pull in their data and sort of present it all in one spot. And again, via the API, you can get a lot of this. We have like a threat intel feed, we call it, where for each IP address, you get sort of a list of all the feeds all of the properties that we assigned to a particular IP address. So details. So this is the IP details page, and you can see here that this IP address scanned port 80, port 443. You sort of see at what dates and times this happened. So now this was the source port here, which is a little bit interesting. And you see how actually here we have the flags. It was not a SYN flag. In this particular case, in which IP address, I don't think it was the one we just looked at, we had a lot of acknowledgement flags. This would probably be a firewall that sort of timed out the connection. So this would be a likely false positive, this particular entry. But again, it teaches us more, for example, about firewalls, that they do time out connections. When do they time it out? This is research data. That's why you shouldn't really use it as a block list without further really thinking about how this may impact your network. So common false positives, if you see the acknowledgement or FIN flag, that's often like firewalls that tear down connections. DNS servers that respond too slowly. You then see a source port of port 53. That's often a false positive. So these are some of the common reasons why you may see a false positive in our data. Other information that we have, how often is a particular port hit? So you all of a sudden see an increase in attacks against a certain port in your network. You want to know why. Why is someone looking for this? Are others seeing same things? The port.html page, it'll help you figure that out and allows you to check on that, what's going on here. And then again, it's not shown here on this slide, but you, for example, get the top IP addresses that are attacking a certain port, and that may also be useful to see, well, is it a research or is it some other reason? And there are comments and such on that page. Like here is the top IP addresses scanning it. A little bit of information about what this port is about. So basically what service is commonly listening on it. Diaries that mention this port. So you can see if there's anything recently we wrote about. And of course, user comments. So you can comment on it too. If you see something new and different on a particular port, go at it and take a look at what's happening there. And then I already mentioned this use case. Is it a targeted attack? So in this case, you're just going to enter an IP address that you are being attacked by, and then by checking, hey, there are thousands of other people being attacked by that same IP address, so it's probably not targeted. And then maybe if you go down the list on the IP info page, you'll see, oh, that's a researcher that is just scanning the internet for whatever. And then you could either block it or maybe check. Some research organizations allow you to send them an email or so and ask them not to scan you. So that's how you then could a response based on what you see. So blocking traffic. Now we do have a feed that has IP addresses that are associated with crypto coin mining. Well, some of these IP addresses are actually Cloudflare IPs. So where the mining pool is behind Cloudflare. By blocking that IP address, you may have some collateral damage. So that's that has happened a couple times. It's still an IP address associated with crypto coin mining. So if you see this in your SIEM, that may still be useful to you. We don't want to remove that IP address. Yeah, and then how long is this good for? Just had a SANS.edu student sort of look at some of that, and once a list like this reaches about a day or so, it really is no longer really all that valuable. Like the top attackers keep changing all the time. Again, unless you have something like a researcher or so scanning the internet over and over. And of course, what's the impact? Like in our top attacker list, I told you that the DNS servers are often a false positive. We had like the Google DNS servers 8888. If you're using DNS servers like this and then they end up being blocked. This may take your network down. So be really careful about that. And then, of course, does it actually prevent any meaningful attacks to import sort of block lists like this blindly? Our top attackers are often like, Mirai bots, bots looking for WordPress and stuff like this. If you have a vulnerable telnet service network, if you're running vulnerable versions of WordPress, this block list is not going to help you. So be careful about just blindly importing block lists. Some of them may be useful for you, like maybe blocking researchers or such, but use them with care. So anyway, this was the first part of our Tech Tuesday. This URL here is still up, and you can use it to sort of experiment, sort of a guided experiment with some of our data. So take a look at it. Let me know how it goes for you. If you have any questions, I'll gladly answer them. And the second part, which is also on YouTube, will then walk you through how to install our honeypot. So thanks for watching this, and any feedback, welcome.